Chesapeake Bay is a massive ecosystem that has suffered greatly from human activity. Chemical and nutrient contamination is the main issue at hand and is to blame for one of the first large-scale marine dead zones. Pollution has also led to the destruction of important ecosystems, something that, in addition to harming the environment, also hurts the fishing industry. Some factors influencing these main problems include excessive deforestation, increased urbanization, agricultural runoff, air pollution, and industrial pollution. The bay is a complex system which receives water from roughly 100,000 rivers and streams. Its watershed spans across multiple states on the east coast and through a variety of environments including forests, farmland, suburbs, and large cities including Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Richmond. Its land-to-water ratio is 15:1, which is larger than any other coastal estuary in the world. This makes it clear that there can be impacts to the bay originating many, many miles away. One significant change that has occurred in this region over the past few centuries is deforestation. Back in the mid-17th century, 95% of the watershed was covered by forests. Now that number has been reduced to roughly 55%. Deforestation has been accompanied by increased urbanization. In an urban setting, stormwater picks up chemicals, oil, sediment, and any other contaminants in its way. Then, because a large portion of urban and even suburban areas are covered by impervious surfaces such as buildings, parking lots, and roads, the water drains straight into waterways. This occurrence is also known as the gray funnel effect. In the two pictures at the bottom of this slide, you can see very dirty water draining into sewers. According to the EPA, this gray funnel effect accounts for about 15% of the total nitrogen entering the bay, and is the only source that is still increasing. Agricultural runoff occurring throughout the bay's watershed is another large source of the bay's polluted state. Farms act as a much better natural filter than urban areas because the ground is covered in vegetation rather than concrete. However, the use of fertilizers has led to increased levels of nitrogen and phosphorus entering the bay. These increased nutrients can lead to marine dead zones, which will be discussed later on in more detail. Some farmers are implementing control methods to reduce their impact on the waterways, such as cover crops, buffer strips, and terracing. You might not think of air pollution being directly linked to water pollution. However, roughly a third of the bay's yearly nitrogen load comes from air pollution. This ends up being about 97.5 million pounds. The Washington, D.C. area was declared the number 9 most polluted city by ozone in the U.S. in 2013. Some contributing factors to this are automobile exhaust as well as industrial emissions. Contaminants in the air can easily be washed into waterways and can be just as harmful as other types of pollution. Industrial pollution is the source of some of the more toxic pollutants that now reside in the bay. An increased push to use natural gas as a clean-burning fuel has also had a negative impact on the environment. The drilling process can lead to groundwater being contaminated by toxic chemicals, salts, and radioactive metals. Coal burning is also to blame for the bay's pollution. Burning of coal, which typically is done at power plants, releases mercury, which eventually makes its way into the waterways. This damages the ecosystems as well as the fishing industry. Eating fish with a high mercury content is discouraged, and therefore the individuals who make their livelihood from fishing in this region have suffered. For this reason, many fishermen are at the forefront of the current effort to clean up the bay. Industrial facilities are also to blame. Sparrows Point Steel is just one example of industrial activity that allowed toxins like benzene, chromium, lead, and zinc to enter the bay.
Can you tell us a little bit about where you live?
Yes, I live in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is right on the East Coast, and I live about a mile away from the Chesapeake Bay and 3 miles away from the Atlantic Ocean, and I also have a canal in my backyard that leads to the Chesapeake Bay.
Would you say that the bay has impacted your life in any way?
Yes, I've been swimming in the bay since I was a little kid, and my dad also works for Volvo Penta, which is the marine engine part of Volvo. So the area needs water, obviously, and it employs a lot of people. So, yes.
Would you say that there's pollution in the bay, or there's a noticeable difference in the cleanliness of the water?
Yes, I wouldn't say it's extremely polluted, but it's definitely not as clean as it could be. I've participated for about 3 or 4 years now. I've participated in Clean the Bay Day, which is it's normally in June, and it's a day when a bunch of different companies and groups get together and go to different parts of the bay and help clean up, whether it be trash or, well, yeah, it's mostly trash, but yes.
Does the whole community, is there a large part of the community that participates in this day?
Yes, it's a lot of, well, yes, it's a lot of the community, but it's also a lot of like bigger companies that might have helped pollute it, or just people who want to get back or get community service. But yes.
Would you say that since they started Clean the Bay Day, has there been an improvement of the quality in the bay?
Yes, I would say there's been an improvement, but it's also they've started to have more oyster farms around the area, and oysters help clean the water. So around like the gas stations for the boats, they have special areas designated for oyster growth, and you can also grow oysters in your backyard, which we participated in. You mail in, and they send you the little net thing to hold them, and so we've done that in our canal to grow oysters and help clean the bay.
Interesting. Is there any other way that water has affected your life?
Yes. Well, we eat the fish and the crabs in the water. We probably shouldn't, since I know crabs are being decimated by us, but they're still pretty good. So we're trying. I know they're trying to get the population to grow more, and they should be. But I know that a lot of people are eating the food in the Chesapeake Bay.
Would you say that most of the restaurants in the area specialize in seafood?
Oh yes, many restaurants, and it's a particular bonus for restaurants to say like we've caught our crabs locally, Chesapeake Bay crabs, which is quite a selling point for the area.
Would you say that the bay is also a major tourist destination?
It's actually not a major tourist destination. It's more of a locals thing. Like, I know when I want to go to the beach, I go to the bay because I know that tourists will not be there. Whereas if you go to the ocean with the boardwalk and the hotels and the tacky tourist shops, you're going to run into a lot of tourists. So the bay is kind of like the local escape that not a lot of tourists know about.
And would you say that not living by the bay would have made your life completely different growing up?
Yes, it probably would have. I'm not going to lie, I don't necessarily like sand. So the bay has not always been my favorite place, but I do enjoy going there. Whereas if I didn't live near water, I wouldn't have gotten the experience of, different things. Paddle boarding, boating, tubing, just going there with my friends and hanging out instead of going to a mall or a movie theater or something. So it's definitely had an impact.
Oh, well, thank you for taking the time for this interview.
Thanks.
The next section of this presentation will focus on dead zones. So you might be wondering, what exactly is a dead zone? Well, we'll start with what it's not. A dead zone is not the fourth installment in the game series, The Last Stand, and has very little to do with zombies. Dead zones are actually used to describe areas which are low oxygen, or in other words, hypoxic. Because most organisms need oxygen to live, few organisms can survive in hypoxic conditions. That is why these areas are called dead zones. The region here shows areas in the Chesapeake Bay where there is sufficient oxygen for organisms to live. This is represented by the blue and green colored areas. On the other hand, hypoxic areas are represented by the red color, easily remembered as red is dead. Well, that sounds bad. So you may be asking why these dead zones occur. Dead zones occur because of a process called eutrophication, which happens when a body of water gets too many nutrients, such as phosphorus and nitrogen. You might be thinking, how can there be such a thing as too many nutrients? Well, at normal levels, these nutrients feed the growth of an organism called cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae. With too many nutrients, however, cyanobacteria grow out of control. This is harmful because cyanobacteria are not good food for zooplankton and fish, and hence accumulate in water, die, and then decompose. When the algae die at the end of the season, the decomposition sucks up much of the available oxygen, making the bottom waters uninhabitable to animals. Human activities are the main cause of these excess nutrients being washed into the ocean. For this reason, dead zones are often located near inhabited coastlines. Eutrophic events have increased because of the rapid rise in intensive agricultural practices, industrial activities, and population growth. Intensive farming uses a large investment of capital and some combination of fertilizer, heavy machinery, irrigation, and other modern farming techniques to maximize output from a plot of land. Heavy use of animal manure and commercial fertilizers in agriculture are the main contributors to eutrophication. Runoff from large agricultural fields enter creeks and bays because of rain or irrigation practices. Corn is the most chemical-intensive crop grown in America, accounting for nearly half of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer use. The mandate to use ethanol as a fuel additive was an effort to reduce the USA's dependence on foreign oil when it was first introduced 6 years ago. The ethanol policies now in place have had unintended and negative consequences on the environment, namely inadvertently spilling nutrients onto the coastal region of areas like the Chesapeake Bay and contributing to these dead zones. The current population growth is also having a negative effect on dead zones. While nutrients are a natural part of the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem, nutrients have never been so abundant in the environment. Before humans built roads, homes, and farm fields, most nutrients were trapped and absorbed by forest and wetland plants. As these habitats were removed to accommodate a growing population, nutrient pollution to the bay increased. Atmospheric sources of nitrogen also contribute to eutrophication in some areas of the world. Fossil fuels and fertilizers release nitrogen into the atmosphere. This atmospheric nitrogen is then redeposited on land and water through the water cycle, rain, and snow. These three processes emit large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. These nutrients enter our air, soil, and water. Human activities have emitted nearly twice as much nitrogen and 3 times as much phosphorus as natural emissions. The Chesapeake Bay on the east coast of the United States has had one of the first dead zones ever identified. The Chesapeake's high levels of nitrogen are caused by 2 factors: urbanization and agriculture. The western part of the bay is full of factories and urban centers that emit nitrogen into the air. Atmospheric nitrogen accounts for about a third of the nitrogen that enters the bay. The eastern part of the bay is a center of poultry farming, which produces large amounts of manure, which end up in the Chesapeake Bay. At this point, you are most likely asking yourself, what can I do to help? Well, to lower nutrient pollution, consider reducing the amount of pollution that can run off your property. Do this by means of installing a green roof or rain barrel to capture and absorb rainfall. Use porous surfaces like gravel or pavers in place of asphalt or concrete, and redirect home downspouts onto grass or gravel rather than paved driveways or sidewalks. If you, or more realistically your parents, have a lawn to take care of, use fertilizers properly. Do not use more than needed. You can also reduce air pollution by walking, biking, or taking public transportation, or using electric or manual lawnmowers and yard tools instead of gas-powered machines.
Now I'm going to discuss the steps that have been taken to remedy the situation in the Chesapeake Bay. After the research in the late 1970s and the early 1980s that were funded by Congress, the research determined that the quality of water and the quality of the wildlife in the Chesapeake Bay had reached a critical condition and action had to be taken. So governors of a couple states and the EPA decided to finally take action. As a result, the Chesapeake Bay program was formed in 1983. The regional partnership consisted of 7 states, including the District of Columbia, government agencies like the EPA and U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as universities like the University of Pennsylvania and the College of William and Mary, and finally other NGOs such as Ducks Unlimited and Ecosystem Solutions. What started as an agreement between just a few states and organizations has now grown to a partnership of over 50 states and organizations. At its conception, the program consisted of only 3 states, plus the EPA and District of Columbia. However, this does make sense since, as you can see, these are the states that most closely lie near the Chesapeake Bay and its watershed. More importantly, though, the agreement outlined 3 major actions. First, an executive council would meet at least twice a year to assess the implementations and plans to improve and protect the water quality and living resources. This executive council consisted mostly of mayors and governors, along with administrators from the EPA. As you might imagine, these would not be the people that you would want tasked with restoring your watershed. So the second task was establishing an implementation committee. This committee was tasked with overseeing the coordination and development of the management plans. Finally, to provide support for the Executive Council and the committee, the EPA would establish a liaison office in their own laboratory. Following the 1983 agreement, the 1987 agreement laid out actual goals and commitments in a very detailed manner with dates and numbers that would help further the restoration of the bay. There were 6 main categories that were outlined, and while I won't cover all of them for the sake of time, I will cover water quality specifically. One of the most notable commitments was to reduce the levels of nitrogen and phosphorus that were entering the main stem of the bay by 40% by the year 2000. This was pursued primarily by addressing the sources of pollution upstream. I would love to show you some data to really show what the results were for the 1987 agreement. However, as you'll see later, it was really hard to find data regarding the restoration progress at that time. So, following the 1987 agreement, Chesapeake 2000 would establish the goals and commitments for the then next 10 years. In addition to the actions, the agreement would include 3 additional states, including Delaware, New York, and West Virginia, which, as you can see, are the next closest states to the Chesapeake Bay. So, once again, there were different categories covered with goals and commitments, and this time there were 5. Again, instead of covering all of them, I'm going to just cover 1, and this time it'll be the living resources, protection, and restoration. Now, there were many goals within this category, broken down by the type of wildlife, so I'm only going to cover the big ones. One of the biggest ones was that they wanted to increase the population of native oysters by a factor of 10. Now, this was achieved by using sanctuaries, aquaculture, disease research, and disease-resistant management strategies. On the fish side, they realized that a large portion of the waterways were blocked, preventing migratory fish from traveling through the Chesapeake Bay. Now, while efforts had been done in the past, this Chesapeake 2000 further set goals and commitments to further these goals. More recently, as you might realize, the Chesapeake 2000 agreement has become outdated as it ended in 2010. The most recent agreement has been the Watershed Agreement of 2014, which is the most recent one since the Chesapeake 2000 agreement, and it was actually just signed this past June. Rather than covering it for the sake of time, I'm going to cover some of the results as to what the efforts have ended up with. So, as you can see, the nitrogen levels in the bay have decreased. Now, the data seems to be pretty sparse, only covering 1985, 2009, and 2013. But overall, the trend does seem to be that the nitrogen levels in the bay are decreasing, which is a great sign. Similarly, the phosphorus levels in the bay are decreasing as per the 1987 Chesapeake Bay Agreement. Now, in order to measure, it's a little bit hard to measure the amount of the oysters or the level of wildlife, so this is just a general index of the number of catches that they were able to get per unit of effort in the Chesapeake Bay. So again, there's a big gap of data, and I don't honestly know why, but the general trend is that the wildlife population has gone up, which is a great sign. Finally, if you're looking at the waterway passages for the migratory fish, you can see that there has been a significant amount of miles of the waterways that have opened up for these migratory fish. In fact, over 2,000 miles have opened up, and the Chesapeake Bay Agreement is 92% of its way towards its final goal. So that concludes the efforts of the Chesapeake Bay Agreements and the Chesapeake Bay Program up until the most recent time now in 2014.
I'm going to briefly mention some actions people are taking when facing the water problems of the Bay, and mainly focus on how those actions in turn catalyze the local economy and increase job employment. One action taken is to improve water treatment systems, and it benefits local people a lot. According to the 2012 report of Chesapeake Bay Foundation, upgrading sewage treatment plants and wastewater and stormwater infrastructure across the watershed has created thousands of construction jobs, and it will create thousands more as the program grows. Upgrading individual septic systems also has employed installers, electricians, and others involved in the business. These upgrades has pumped millions of dollars into the region's economy. Another strategy is to control stormwater runoff. And let's check out how many jobs does it bring up. First, let's look at Montgomery County, since it's the most active one in building up a network of stormwater pollution control devices. It is reported that roughly 3,300 construction workers will be employed over the next 3.5 years to contribute to the projects. And according to a report called Waterworks, stormwater control projects like Montgomery counties would create around 33 temporary construction jobs across Maryland over the next 5 years, as well as 10,000 jobs in the District of Columbia, 80,000 jobs in Pennsylvania, and 52,000 jobs in Virginia. And here's a warm quote from Marcus Ivan. He said, "It is a beautiful thing for me to be working again, feel like an adult again, and putting food on the table for my family." Thirdly, people also train their best to reduce pollutions from farms. It is again very beneficial. A study by the University of Virginia found that implementing agricultural practices such as livestock stream exclusions buffers and cover crops in Virginia to the levels necessary to restore the bay would create nearly 12,000 jobs of approximately 1 year's duration. Implementation of agricultural practices would also generate significant economic impacts. Based on the research, every $1 of state or federal funding invested in agriculture-based management practices will generate $1.56 in academic activity in Virginia. I want to end up with an encouraging result from a survey in Virginia. It stated 80% of the respondents agree with the statement that we can protect the water quality in the rivers, creeks, and the Chesapeake Bay, and have a strong economy with good jobs for Virginians without having to choose one over the other. And they also believe that implementations of the Clean Water Blueprint for the Chesapeake Bay and its rivers and streams will result in clean water, a healthy bay, and a strong regional economy.